Look at these two paintings. They seem like identical twins of the same cave, same Holy Family, same master. Most see just a repeat of a pious scene, but these twins are actually enemies. One was rejected as unorthodox, while the other was a sanitized legal compromise. Why did the first version spark a 25-year war between a genius and his church patrons? The differences aren't purely artistic. They are theological battlegrounds hiding secrets. Today we look beneath the layers of paint to reveal a hidden ghost composition and a pointing finger that almost cost Leonardo his career. Let's step into the shadows of the grotto and discover why Leonardo was centuries ahead of his time. We are decoding masterpieces. We tell the stories of how the world's greatest masterpieces were made and the hidden wars that nearly destroyed them. If decoding the secrets of art history is your thing, subscribe. We have many more of these coming. Now let's get back to the mystery of the rocks. Step into the Salle des États in the Louvre. Usually the air here is thick with the frantic energy of crowds surging toward the Mona Lisa. But if you turn your back on that famous smile and walk just a few paces, you will find yourself standing before a doorway into another world. It is a world of shadows, damp stone, and an unsettling, primordial silence. This is Leonardo da Vinci's The Virgin of the Rocks. At first glance, what you see is a mastery of light and shadow that feels almost impossible for the year 1483. We are looking at a large panel, nearly 2 meters tall, and the first thing that strikes you isn't the figures, but the environment. We aren't in a palace or a sun-drenched Italian meadow. We are deep inside a cavern. Jagged, prehistoric-looking limestone pillars rise from the gloom, framing a distant, hazy glimpse of water and mountains. The air looks heavy, almost humid. In the center of this grotto sit 4 figures. A young woman, the Virgin Mary, occupies the heart of the composition. Her expression is one of profound, quiet grace. She has her right arm wrapped around a small kneeling child, while her left hand hovers, almost protectively, over the head of another infant. To her left, an angel with copper-colored hair and magnificent sweeping wings looks directly out at us, the viewers. The colors here are warm, dominated by deep ambers, earthy browns, and the rich, dark blue of Mary's mantle. But look at the edges of the figures. Do you notice how they seem to melt into the shadows? This is Leonardo's signature sfumato, the smoky technique where he abandons harsh outlines in favor of soft, atmospheric transitions. It makes the scene feel less like a painting and more like a fleeting vision glimpsed through a mist. But now imagine traveling nearly 300 miles north to the National Gallery in London. You walk into room 9, and there you find what appears to be the exact same painting. At a distance, the composition is identical. The same cave, the same 4 figures, the same pyramidal arrangement, but as you step closer, the mood shifts. The London version is colder, bathed in a piercing blue-toned light. The rocks feel sharper, more defined. The soft amber glow of the Paris version has been replaced by something more crystalline, more detached, and then you start to notice the fixes. In this London version, the infants have golden halos. The child on the left now holds a long, slender reed cross. The angel no longer looks at you. Her eyes are cast down in prayer, and perhaps most significantly, that strange pointing gesture of the angel. The one so prominent in the Louvre is completely gone. Why would the most celebrated genius of the Renaissance paint the same complex scene twice, only to change these specific, seemingly small details? Why does the first version feel like a mysterious, organic dream, while the second feels like a carefully corrected document? On the surface, we are looking at a standard religious scene, the flight into Egypt, where the Holy Family purportedly met John the Baptist in the wilderness, It's a story of sanctuary and divine protection. But the sheer existence of these two twins tells us that something went wrong. This wasn't a case of an artist simply liking a theme enough to repeat it. This was the result of a 25-year legal battle, a theological scandal, and a confrontation between an artist who saw the world through the lens of science and a client who demanded the rigid safety of tradition. Before we can understand the war that broke out over these panels, we have to understand the man who walked into a Milanese workshop in 1483 with a mind that was already racing decades ahead of his contemporaries. To understand why the Virgin of the Rocks looks the way it does, we have to look at where Leonardo da Vinci was in his life when he received the commission. The year was 1482. Leonardo was 30 years old and he was, quite frankly, restless. He had spent his youth in Florence training in the prestigious workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. He was already recognized as a formidable talent, but Florence was a city of bankers and poets, a place where art was often defined by clarity, sharp lines, and intellectual puzzles. Leonardo, however, was becoming obsessed with something else, the mechanics of the natural world. He didn't just want to paint a mountain, he wanted to understand how the mountain was formed. He didn't just want to paint a human face, he wanted to know how the muscles beneath the skin created an expression. Feeling stifled in Florence, Leonardo made a bold move. He headed north to Milan, the powerhouse of Lombardy. But he didn't go there as a famous painter. In fact, when he wrote his famous cover letter to the ruler of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, he listed his skills in 10 points. Points 1 through 9 were about his ability to design armored vehicles, giant crossbows, portable bridges, and naval defenses. Only in the 10th point, almost as an afterthought, did he mention, I can also carry out sculpture in marble, bronze, or clay, and also in painting I can do as much as can be done. Leonardo was presenting himself as a military engineer, a man of practical, earth-shaking science. But when he arrived in Milan, the massive military contracts didn't materialize immediately. He needed work. He needed a way to establish his reputation in a city that didn't know him. He found his opportunity through a partnership. He teamed up with two local artists, the brothers Ambrogio and Evangelista de Paredes. This was a strategic alliance. The de Paredes brothers had the local connections in the physical workshop space that Leonardo lacked. Ambrogio was a respectable portraitist and a court official, a man who knew how to navigate the bureaucracy of Milanese patronage. On April 25, 1483, this team, Leonardo and the de Paredes brothers, signed a contract that should have been the crowning achievement of their early careers. The client was the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception, a wealthy group of lay people associated with the Church of San Francesco Grande. The contract was incredibly specific. It wasn't just for a painting, it was for a massive, multi-part altarpiece. The Confraternity had already commissioned a woodcarver named Giacomo del Mino to create a giant, ornate wooden frame with niches and pedestals. Leonardo's job was to provide the central painted panel. The de Paredes brothers were to paint the side panels, featuring angels playing musical instruments. The contract even told them what the colors should be. It specified fine gold and ultramarine, the most expensive blue pigment made from ground lapis lazuli. The patrons wanted luxury. They wanted a display of wealth that would honor the Virgin Mary and, by extension, their own prestige. But there was a problem brewing from day one. The Confraternity expected a traditional, clear, and liturgically correct image. They expected Leonardo to be a craftsman who followed orders. They didn't realize they had hired a man who was currently filling his notebooks with studies of how water eddies around stones and how light refracts through damp air. Leonardo began work on what we now call the Louvre version. This was his first version, and he poured into it everything he was learning about the physical world. He didn't want to paint a symbolic cave. He wanted to paint a real cave. He studied the strata of the rocks, the specific species of plants that grow in damp, sunless environments, the iris, the columbine, the ferns. But as the months turned into years, Leonardo's notorious habit began to surface: non finito. He was a perfectionist who often found the process of discovery more interesting than the process of finishing. While he was obsessing over the botanical accuracy of a leaf or the way light hit the archangel's curls, the Confraternity was checking their watches. They had promised a total of 800 lire for the work. But as the 1480s dragged on, Leonardo and the De Pretis brothers realized that the sheer amount of labor Leonardo was pouring into the central panel far exceeded the original price. They felt they were being underpaid for a masterpiece. The patrons, on the other hand, felt they were being ghosted by a temperamental artist who was ignoring their specific iconographic requirements. This wasn't just a dispute over money, it was a collision of two different worlds. To understand why the Confraternity was so upset with what Leonardo eventually delivered, we have to look at the explosive religious atmosphere of 15th century Milan. If you were a resident of Milan in 1483, religion wasn't just a Sunday activity, it was the framework of your entire reality. And the specific topic that the Confraternity was obsessed with was one of the most hotly debated ideas in the Catholic world: the Immaculate Conception. Now, today, many people confuse the Immaculate Conception with the virgin birth of Jesus, but in Leonardo's time, people knew the difference. The Immaculate Conception was the belief that Mary herself was conceived without original sin. The idea was that from the very first moment of her existence, she was a pure, sanctified vessel, chosen by God before the world began. This might sound like a minor point of theology today, but in the 1480s, it was a battleground. On one side, you had the Maculists, mostly the Dominicans, who argued that everyone, including Mary, needed the redemption of Christ and therefore must have been born with sin. On the other side, you had the Immaculists, mostly the Franciscans and our Confraternity, who argued for Mary's absolute preordained purity. The stakes were high. Just 7 years before this commission, in 1476, Pope Sixtus IV had officially recognized the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. Our patrons in Milan were eager to champion this new victory. They wanted a painting that shouted their beliefs to the world. They wanted Mary to be shown as the untainted sanctuary, the Queen of Heaven, set apart from the messiness of the natural world. And then Leonardo gave them a cave. Think about how a contemporary viewer would have seen this. Traditionally, Mary was often depicted in a hortus conclusus, a beautiful enclosed garden filled with roses and lilies, symbols of her purity. Instead, Leonardo places her in a dark, jagged grotto. Why? Scholars like Pietro Marani have suggested that for Leonardo, the cave wasn't a place of darkness, but a womb of the earth. He was connecting the divine story to the geological story of the planet itself. To Leonardo, the rocks were the bones of the world, and by placing Mary inside them, he was suggesting that her purity was a fundamental elemental part of nature. But there was another cultural layer at play here. Leonardo was a Florentine. In Florence, the patron saint was Saint John the Baptist. Florentines were obsessed with John, the voice crying in the wilderness, the one who recognized the Messiah while both were still infants. In Leonardo's Louvre version, the infant John the Baptist is given a role of incredible prominence. According to legend, during the flight into Egypt, the Holy Family took refuge in a cave and met the young John, who was being protected by the archangel Uriel. This meeting provided a crucial witness to Christ's divinity. However, in the late 15th century, the church was very protective of the hierarchy between Jesus and John. John was the forerunner, but Jesus was the savior. If a painting made John look too important, or if it wasn't clear who was who, it could be seen as borderline heretical. This is where the political and social tensions of Milan begin to bleed into the paint. The Sforza family who ruled Milan needed religious legitimacy. They supported the Confraternity. They wanted art that was clear, powerful, and reinforced the hierarchy of the church. They wanted an altarpiece that told a specific story about Mary's role in salvation. Leonardo, however, was painting a story about the mystery of nature and the silent, subtle ways the divine interacts with the physical world. He wasn't interested in making a propaganda poster. He was interested in the sfumato of reality, the way truth is often hidden in the shadows. When Leonardo finally presented the Louvre version to the Confraternity, they didn't see a masterpiece of light and shadow. They saw a painting that lacked halos. They saw a painting where the archangel was making a very strange, very prominent pointing gesture, and they saw a painting that didn't clearly distinguish between the two infants. They were paying for a statement of faith. They felt they had received a riddle, and so they refused to pay the bonus the artists were asking for. This sparked a legal war that would last for 25 years, forcing Leonardo to return to the subject a decade later to create the corrected version we now see in London. But to understand the true nature of their anger, we have to look at the details that Leonardo chose to hide and the one gesture he chose to emphasize. Let's begin our journey into the painting itself. Imagine we are standing before the Louvre version, the one Leonardo originally painted for the Milanese chapel. At first glance, the composition is a perfect pyramid, the most stable and harmonious shape in Renaissance art. Mary forms the apex. Her head is the highest point. To her right, our left, is a kneeling infant. To her left, our right, is another infant, sitting on the ground, accompanied by an angel. But here is where the confusion begins for a 15th century viewer. Who is the Messiah? In almost any other painting of the era, the answer would be obvious. Jesus would have a golden halo. He might be sitting in his mother's lap. He would be the center of attention. But in this version, Leonardo gives neither child a halo. Look at the infant on the left, the one Mary has her arm around. He is kneeling in a posture of deep devotion, his hands clasped in prayer. He is looking toward the other child. This is John the Baptist. Now look at the child on the right. He is sitting on the ground, supported by the archangel Uriel. He is raising 2 fingers of his right hand in a gesture of blessing. This is the infant Jesus. Notice the visual hierarchy Leonardo has created. Mary has her hand on John's shoulder, physically drawing him into the sacred circle. Her other hand hovers over Jesus' head, but it's a strangely tense gesture. Her fingers are spread, and if you look at the perspective, her hand seems to be casting a shadow over the Christ child's head. And then there is the archangel Uriel. In this Louvre version, Uriel is the only figure looking directly at us. He is breaking the fourth wall. He is inviting us into the scene. But look at his right hand. He has one finger extended, pointing straight across the composition at the infant John the Baptist. This is the famous pointing finger of the Louvre version. Why is it there? On a narrative level, it seems to say, look at this child. This is the one who will announce the coming of the Lord. It reinforces John's role as the witness. But for the Confraternity, this gesture was a disaster. By pointing so emphatically at John, the angel creates a visual line that bypasses Jesus entirely. Furthermore, the angel's hand is positioned directly beneath Mary's hovering left hand. If you follow the lines, the angel's finger is pointing right at the spot where John is kneeling, while Mary's hand looks like it's crowning John, not Jesus. To a literal-minded patron in 1483, this looked like Leonardo was elevating John the Baptist over the Son of God. It felt unorthodox. In a time when every gesture was read for theological meaning, this V shape formed by the angel's pointing finger and Mary's hand was seen as confusing, if not outright threatening. There is even a darker interpretation that scholars have debated for centuries. Some suggest that Uriel's hand doesn't just point, it looks like a blade. The way the hand is foreshortened, it's as if the angel is making a cutting motion near the head of the Christ child. While Leonardo likely intended it as a complex study of perspective and human interaction, the patron saw something that disturbed the peaceful, devotional purpose of the altarpiece. But wait, let's look at another detail that most people walk right past. Look at the ground between the figures. Leonardo was an expert botanist. In the Louvre version, the plants are rendered with scientific precision. We see the Iris germanica, the sword lily, which was a traditional symbol of Mary's sorrow, the sword that would pierce her heart. We see the Aquilegia, or columbine, which represents the Holy Spirit. But Leonardo doesn't just place them there as symbols. He places them where they would actually grow. He understands that these plants thrive in the damp, shaded environment of a limestone cave. He is using the truth of nature to validate the truth of the religion. This brings us to the sfumato. Look at the faces of the children. They aren't the chubby, stylized cherubs of earlier Renaissance art. They have the soft, delicate features of real babies. The shadows around their eyes and under their chins are so subtle they seem to vibrate. Leonardo was pioneering a new way of seeing. He believed that light and shadow, chiaroscuro, were the keys to representing life. Shadow, he wrote in his notebooks, is the means by which bodies display their form. By blurring the edges of his figures, he was making them part of the atmosphere. He was saying that the divine isn't something that sits on top of the world. It is something that emerges from it. But the Confraternity didn't want emergence. They wanted clarity. They wanted to know exactly who was who and why they were there. The disagreement eventually became so bitter that the artist filed a formal petition to the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. They argued that they had spent years on a work of extraordinary quality and that the Confraternity was trying to cheat them. The result of this deadlock was a strange compromise. Leonardo didn't give the Louvre version to the Confraternity. Instead, he, or his partners, likely sold it to a private buyer, possibly the King of France, who was a huge admirer of Leonardo. This would explain why the original painting ended up in the French royal collection. But the legal obligation to the Confraternity remained. Leonardo still owed them a central panel for their altarpiece. And so, nearly a decade after he started the first one, Leonardo began the London version. This was his sanitized twin. He was going to give the patrons exactly what they asked for, or so they thought. But as we are about to see, Leonardo couldn't help himself. Even when he was correcting his work for a difficult client, he was hiding new secrets beneath the surface. Secrets that would only be revealed 500 years later by modern X-rays and infrared technology. What we've uncovered so far, the legal battles, the pointing finger, the confusion over the infants, only scratches the surface of the drama behind these rocks. Because when Leonardo sat down to paint the second version, he didn't just copy the first. He started with a completely different, even more mysterious idea. An idea he tried to hide forever. We left our story at a moment of profound tension. Leonardo da Vinci had created a masterpiece, a revolution in light and shadow, but his patrons, the Confraternity of the Immaculate Conception, were far from happy. They wanted clarity. He gave them mystery. They wanted tradition. He gave them geology. Now, let's look at the fix. We must travel from the Louvre in Paris to the National Gallery in London to examine the second version of the Virgin of the Rocks. It was painted years later, beginning around 1491, though it wouldn't be fully completed and delivered until 1508. At first glance, it looks like a faithful copy. But as we move from the surface into the deeper layers of the paint, we begin to see the scars of a 25-year legal battle. Look first at the overall atmosphere. If the Louvre version feels like a warm, amber-tinted dream, the London version is a cool, blue-hued reality. The rocks are sharper. The light is more surgical. This is layer 2 of our investigation. The subtle details that change the entire meaning of the work. Notice the most obvious changes, the ones the Confraternity likely demanded. In the London version, the infants Jesus and John are no longer unlabeled. John the Baptist now carries a long, slender reed cross, the traditional symbol of his role as the forerunner. Furthermore, both children and the Virgin Mary now have thin, elegant, golden halos. Why do these matter? Because they strip away the ambiguity that Leonardo loved. In the first version, Leonardo was making a radical point, that the divine is found in the humanness of the figures. He didn't need halos to tell you they were holy. Their presence and the light that touched them were enough. But for a church altarpiece in the 1490s, unlabeled divinity was dangerous. The halos and the cross act like subtitles in a movie, ensuring that even the most uneducated viewer knows exactly who the main characters are. But the biggest change is the Archangel Uriel. Look closely at her. In the Paris version, she was looking right at us, her hand raised in that provocative V-shaped pointing gesture. In the London version, that hand is gone. It's been tucked away, no longer pointing at John the Baptist. Her other hand, which in the Louvre version was supporting Jesus, is now resting more passively. And her eyes, they no longer challenge the viewer. She looks inward, her gaze cast down in a posture of traditional quiet piety. By removing the pointing finger, Leonardo removed the threat. There's no longer a visual line that bypasses Jesus. The controversial blade near the Christ child's head has been retracted. The painting has been sanitized. It is safer, more conventional, and to the eyes of many art historians, slightly less Leonardo. But wait, there's a reason for that. If you look at the botanical details in the foreground of the London version, you'll notice something strange. The flowers are less accurate. In the Louvre version, a botanist can identify the exact species of iris or columbine. In the London version, the plants are more generic, almost stylized. This brings us to a crucial discovery. Leonardo didn't paint this version alone. While he designed the composition and painted the faces of the central figures, much of the landscape and the secondary details were likely executed by his partners, the De Pretis brothers. Leonardo was a man who hated repeating himself. To him, the problem of the Virgin of the Rocks had already been solved in the 1480s. Painting it again was a chore, a legal obligation he was trying to fulfill while his mind was already moving on to the Last Supper and his studies of human anatomy. However, the London version holds a secret that is even more shocking than a few stylized flowers. It is a secret that was hidden from the human eye for half a millennium, only to be revealed by the cutting edge of 21st century science. In 2005, and again with more advanced technology in 2019, the National Gallery in London subjected their version of the Virgin of the Rocks to infrared reflectography. For those of us who aren't conservation scientists, infrared reflectography is essentially a way of seeing through the top layers of paint. It detects the carbon in the underdrawings, the original sketches an artist makes on the wood panel before they start applying color. What the scientists found was a revelation. Beneath the cool blue landscape of the London version, there isn't just one painting. There are three. As the infrared scanners moved across the panel, a ghost began to emerge. It wasn't a sketch of the Virgin of the Rocks at all. It was a completely different composition. In this hidden layer 4, we see a very different Mary. She isn't kneeling in a cave. Instead, she is shown in a much more dramatic, emotional pose. Her right hand is pressed against her breast in a gesture of surprise or devotion, and her left arm is extended, reaching out toward an infant. Scholars believe this was an early plan for an adoration of the Christ child. It was a more traditional, perhaps more Italian scene, filled with a sense of movement and psychological intensity that we see in Leonardo's earlier works, like the Adoration of the Magi. This discovery changes everything we thought we knew about the London painting. It tells us that when Leonardo sat down to start the second version in the early 1490s, he didn't want to make a copy. He wanted to start over. He wanted to create something entirely new, perhaps to satisfy his own artistic curiosity, or to finally give the patrons something that fit their traditional tastes better. But then something happened. He stopped. He abandoned the Adoration sketch and literally painted over it, returning to the original rocks composition from 10 years earlier. Why? The answer lies in the archives of the Milanese courts. The legal battle with the Confraternity was reaching a fever pitch. The patrons didn't want a new Leonardo. They wanted the specific painting they had contracted for back in 1483. They wanted the Virgin of the Rocks, just without the heretical bits. Imagine the scene. Leonardo, the man who would eventually be known as the greatest genius of his age, being told by a group of church bureaucrats that he wasn't allowed to innovate. He was being forced by a legal contract to replicate a decade-old design. This is the revelation moment for the viewer. The Virgin of the Rocks in London isn't just a painting. It's a compromise. It is a document of an artist's frustration. Leonardo's original sketch, the more emotional Mary with her hand to her heart, was his attempt to escape the shadow of his first version. When he was forced to abandon it, he seems to have handed much of the work over to his assistants. But even in this compromised second version, Leonardo's obsession with science couldn't be entirely suppressed. Scientific analysis has shown that the rocks in the London version, while different from the Louvre version, are still geologically fascinating. They represent layered limestone, the kind of a rock that forms over eons through the accumulation of sediment. Even when he was being sued, even when he was being forced to copy himself, Leonardo was thinking about deep time. He was thinking about the age of the earth. In an era when most people believed the world was only a few thousand years old, Leonardo was painting rocks that suggested a history spanning millions of years. This brings us to the most profound question of all. What was Leonardo ultimately trying to say? When you look past the legal disputes, the pointing fingers, and the hidden sketches, what is the deeper meaning of this work? To find the heart of the Virgin of the Rocks, we have to stop looking at it as a religious painting and start looking at it as a philosophical manifesto. Leonardo da Vinci did not see a separation between science and religion. To him, studying the way a river carves a valley or the way light bends through a drop of water was a form of worship. He believed that the laws of nature were the laws of God. This is why the rocks are the most important part of the title. In the 15th century, most artists treated the landscape as a backdrop, a wallpaper to fill the space behind the important people. But for Leonardo, the landscape is the subject. Think about where we are in this painting. We are in a grotto. In the Bible, caves are places of both birth and burial. They are the womb and the tomb. By placing the Virgin Mary, the immaculate vessel, inside this prehistoric limestone cavern, Leonardo is connecting her to the very foundations of the earth. The art historian Martin Kemp, one of the world's leading Leonardo scholars, speaks of the unity of nature and spirit in Leonardo's work. Leonardo wasn't just painting a scene from the life of Christ. He was painting the cosmos. The water in the background, the humidity in the air, which he captures through sfumato, and the ancient rocks all represent the four elements: earth, water, air, and fire, represented by the light. This is a universal theme that resonates across centuries. It's the idea that we are not separate from nature. We are a part of it. The infants Jesus and John, sitting on the damp earth, are not divine invaders from another realm. They are shown as fragile, beautiful parts of the natural world. There's also a meditation here on the ancient versus the new. The rocks are old, incredibly old. They represent the old law, the world before grace. The children represent the new era. By placing the new life of the children against the ancient crumbling stone of the cave, Leonardo is showing the continuous cycle of life, death, and renewal. But what about that 25-year legal war? What does that tell us about the meaning of the work? It tells us that Leonardo was a man who was profoundly ahead of his time in his demand for artistic autonomy. Before Leonardo, artists were often treated like high-end plumbers or carpenters. You gave them a contract, you told them what to paint, and they did it. But Leonardo was the first modern artist. He believed that his vision, his scientific and poetic understanding of the world, was more important than the patron's instructions. He was willing to endure decades of lawsuits. He was willing to sell the original to a foreign king, and he was willing to let his assistants finish the second version rather than sacrifice his integrity. When we look at the London and Paris versions together, we are seeing the birth of the artist as hero. We are seeing the moment when art stopped being just about telling a story and started being about revealing a truth. And that truth was sometimes dangerous. The pointing finger of the Louvre version was a secret signal, a reminder that the witness, John/the artist, is just as important as the subject. It was Leonardo's way of saying, don't just look at what I've painted, look at where I am pointing, look at the world I am revealing to you. The influence of the Virgin of the Rocks was immediate and overwhelming. Even though it was tucked away in a private chapel in Milan for years, word of its brilliance spread like wildfire through the artistic community. Before this painting, the Madonna and Child was usually a static, formal image. After this painting, everything changed. A young artist named Raphael, who would become one of the three giants of the High Renaissance alongside Leonardo and Michelangelo, was clearly obsessed with it. If you look at Raphael's famous Madonnas, like the Madonna of the Goldfinch or the Belle Jardiniere, you see Leonardo's fingerprints everywhere. Raphael adopted the pyramidal composition, the soft lighting, and the psychological interaction between the children. But Raphael cleaned it up even further. He took Leonardo's complexity and made it graceful and easy to digest. He turned Leonardo's cave back into a sunny meadow. But the original mystery of Leonardo's rocks couldn't be so easily tamed. Throughout the 16th century, a group of artists known as the Leonardeschi, the followers of Leonardo, made dozens of copies of the Virgin of the Rocks. You can find these versions today in museums from Los Angeles to St. Petersburg. Each one tries to capture that sfumato magic, but none of them quite reach the haunting depth of the original. Then there is the mystery of the provenance, the journey these paintings took through history. The Louvre version, as we've seen, likely ended up in the hands of the French King Louis XII. It became a crown jewel of the French royal collection, eventually being moved from its original wooden panel to canvas in 1806 to preserve it. This Paris twin became the gold standard for Leonardo's genius. The London version had a much stranger journey. After the Confraternity's church was demolished in the late 18th century, the painting was moved to a nearby hospital. In 1785, an adventurous Scottish artist and art dealer named Gavin Hamilton bought it from the hospital for a relatively small sum. He brought it to England, where it passed through several private collections before finally being purchased by the National Gallery in 1880. For a long time, many scholars actually thought the London version was the only one, or that the Paris version was a later copy. It took decades of archival research and the detective work of art historians to piece together the 1483 contract and the legal dispute. It wasn't until the 20th century that the full story of the two versions was finally understood. Today, the Virgin of the Rocks is more than just a famous painting. It is a symbol of the intersection between art and science. It is referenced in everything from Dan Brown's novels to modern cinematography. Why? Because it taps into something we still feel today, the sense that there is a hidden world just beneath the surface of the one we see. We live in an age of high-resolution images and instant information. We think we know everything about the world. But standing before the Virgin of the Rocks, we are reminded that some things remain sfumato, smoky, blurred, and mysterious. Leonardo was ahead of his time not because he predicted the future, but because he understood that the more we learn about nature, the more miraculous it becomes. He used his 25-year legal battle not as a defeat, but as a chance to refine his vision. He moved from the provocation of the pointing finger to the meditation of the cooler, blue landscape. Let's return one last time to that dark grotto. Imagine the candles flickering in the church of San Francesco Grande in Milan 500 years ago. When a contemporary viewer looked at this painting, they saw a story of Mary and the infants. They saw a religious duty fulfilled. They saw a beautiful altarpiece. But when we look at it now, equipped with everything we've uncovered, the legal wars, the hidden underdrawings, the geological precision, and the theological controversies, we see something much bigger. We see an artist who refused to be small. We see Leonardo da Vinci standing in a Milanese workshop looking at a piece of wood and seeing not just a surface for paint, but a window into the history of the earth. We see a man who was willing to let a pointing finger spark a decades-long feud because he believed that the witness must be recognized. We see the first version in Paris with its warm human glow and its dangerous ambiguity. And we see the second version in London with its cool scientific distance and its hidden ghost of an abandoned dream. Together, these two paintings tell the true story of the Renaissance. It wasn't just a time of pretty pictures. It was a time of intellectual combat. It was a time when the old rocks of tradition were being broken apart by the new light of observation. As you walk away from the Louvre or the National Gallery, that pointing finger follows you. It isn't just pointing at John the Baptist, it is pointing at the world around us. It is an invitation from Leonardo to look closer, to question what we are told, and to find the divine not in the golden halos of tradition, but in the soft shadows of the real world. In the end, the Virgin of the Rocks is another proof that Leonardo was ahead of his time, not because he had all the answers, but because he was the first artist brave enough to paint the questions. The silence of the cave remains. The water in the distance continues to flow, and the mystery of the twins continues to captivate us, reminding us that even in the darkest grotto, there is always a light waiting to be discovered.